Hello? Rescue hooks to rescue, Mayday! Get ahead, West. Fast Mayday, what's your location? Get the hell out of here, hurry up! We need radio silence, baby. Water in that 2.5 inch line. 48 inch water in a 2.5 inch line. To the rope, to the rope. 35 in the rear, 35 in the rear.
Welcome to the Emergency Traffic Podcast. Hello there, this is your producer and host, Paul Prevost. Welcome to a new segment of the Emergency Traffic Podcast, where we review line-of-duty death reports and share the learnings. We're calling this new segment From the Archives, the Last Century. Although we have done about a dozen episodes during the last 4 years that occurred before 2000, usually for significant incidents such as the Pang Fire in Seattle, the Meridian One Bank in Philly, the Kingman, Arizona explosion, Kansas City explosion, or the Vandalia wind-driven high-rise fire. We generally only try to feature line-of-duty death incidents that have occurred in the last 25 years. So we are going to start a new feature, featuring one episode a month in addition to the two current era ones that happened in the last 25 years, called From the Archives of the Last Century that are over 25 years old. These will have a different title so you can tell them from the rest. I hope you enjoyed learning about these older incidents. This month, in episode number 69, From the Archives, we go back to 1993 in Pittston, Pennsylvania, where two volunteer firefighters were killed while trying to find a concealed fire in a large old commercial building. Our regular co-host Denis and I are joined by our guest host, retired Fire Chief Gordon Routley, who led the investigation on this incident back in 1993 while working for the U.S. Fire Administration. I hope you enjoy this look back at the last century with us. Now let me bring in Denis and Gordon. So, hello, Denis, and our special guest, Gordon J. Routley, recently retired fire chief from Montreal. First of all, hi guys, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
I'm good. I'm podcasting. I like doing this. It's my hobby.
Says, welcome from Halifax here, the ice capital of Canada at the moment.
I heard there's like a salt shortage.
Yes, well, every time I go out my door, I have to make a decision. Am I skating down my driveway or sliding?
Wow, you just got a whole bunch of rain and then it froze, or?
Well, no, it snowed, and then it rained, and then it freezing rained, and then it froze, and a couple days later it snowed, and then it freezing rained and rained for a period of 12 hours, and then it froze, and it's been polished by a couple snowfalls and rainfalls and sunshine since then. And I can't even get through it. I got a 6-foot iron bar. And it takes all your strength whacking it down on the concrete to break the ice. And you can't get snow and salt. It's salt and sand. It's just not available.
I saw somebody said there's like big salt shortage in Nova Scotia because of all the ice you've had.
Yeah. Wow. Not that salt works at minus 15 anyways.
It doesn't. It's too cool. Yeah. We had the big freeze here. We've been like 3-4 weeks or something, was really, really cold. Yeah. I missed a couple weeks of it because we were on the West Coast. Yeah. And then we came back to it and it was still cold and it broke yesterday.
Yeah. So my theory is if I stand outside and swear loudly enough, it'll melt.
Eventually.
It's not working. Yes, just saying.
And Gordon, you're enjoying the stories of salt and snow and ice, and while you're
feeling guilty.
Feeling guilty.
Yeah, I bet you
can
are.
tell. You look on your face, and you're just guilty about it. Yeah. Well, you deserve it. All good.
Well, our readers don't know he's in Florida.
No, but now they do. Awesome. It's a cross-border show. I like it. Okay. Earlier this year, we started doing these FDNY tips as part of every episode. So I'll just read one here. FDNY, for the past 4 or 5 years, has published a PDF booklet of tips that they've learned from recent events. So this is tip number 6, and it talks about VEIS, Vent, Enter, Isolate, and Search. So some tips about doing that. Remove any child gates before entering and check for the presence of a floor before you enter if you're doing vent, enter, isolate, search. It's a time-tested tactic for the firefighter. Our ability to isolate the fire and search has saved many lives. However, this tactic must be completed safely and must also be coordinated with those operating inside the structure, considering the following points. Ask permission prior to doing a vent, enter, isolate, and search. If there's an urgent life hazard and VEIS must be attempted immediately, first notify the ladder company officer operating in the fire apartment. Venting a window may impact fire conditions, and we've done lots of podcasts where venting a window has impacted fire conditions, whether it was done on purpose or it did it on its own.
And when we were doing that, it was because somebody had died. So
Right.
Opening the window was part of the fatality chain of events.
Exactly, like that Vandalia Avenue fire in New York that no one opened the window. It just was when the door got open to the fire apartment, the whole hallway went up. When you're clearing the window entirely prior to entering, remove all window bars, child gates, emergency egress, or victim removal may necessitate a large opening. Turn the window into a door. Small bolt cutters work well when removing child gates. While operating on an aerial ladder, consider attaching your personal harness hook to a ladder rung or rail while you're removing the window. This may prevent you from falling off the ladder when you're clearing the opening in case you move suddenly or something. When entering the room from the exterior, it's imperative to check for the presence of a floor. Drop a tool, listen for it to strike the floor, or probe the area you are entering with a hook. Buildings under construction or various renovations may have created an opening in front of the window. Entering a window is best accomplished by entering feet first. Once inside, gain control of the flow path by closing the door prior to conducting a search. That's the tip, number 6 from FDNY.
You also might find the victim you're looking for under the window also.
Yes.
They don't mention that in there, but that's a distinct
Yeah.
possibility.
Some current events that I usually put a list in here that we can chime in on. The recent tunnel fire, not that you normally get these in North America, but a tunnel in Green River, Wyoming, 3 dead so far, posed significant challenges for the suppression and rescue crews to get at it. The fire was actually at the other end of the tunnel from the municipality, so they couldn't get at it easily with apparatus and equipment, and of course the conditions within the tunnel were untenable. 3 dead so far, I think.
Yeah, one from Nova Scotia.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
One,
Yeah, a truck driver from Nova Scotia was one of the victims.
There's a video online of a truck driver who stopped just before the truck that had crashed in the tunnel was on fire. And if you haven't seen that video, you really should, because he damaged his truck. He was up against the wall. He had to go through the windshield, and he got out of that tunnel by the skin of his teeth.
Yes.
When as he says on the outside, he says, "I didn't think I'd be standing here seeing this." He didn't think he was going to survive it.
It was pretty impressive. He tried to open the door and he was up against the wall, so he'd kicking the windshield out, and I think he actually went out that way or out the passenger door. I'm not sure which. But
well, it's hard to tell. The camera was doing this.
Yeah. It was.
And for those of you who can't see, my fingers are going around.
I think he grabbed the dash cam is what happened. Is the truck had a dash cam, and he grabbed it on his way out so that it recorded it.
Yeah, it's a pretty hairy situation because that tunnel is pretty much bare concrete, and I don't remember how many 100 feet long, and it slopes upward. So there was a natural draft in one direction. So if you were if you were on the approach side, then all the smoke and heat was coming in your direction. I think they ended up with about 18 vehicles were involved, something like that.
Something like that. Yeah. So if there's a tunnel in your jurisdiction, you need to have a plan.
Yeah, and when my last job, we did have tunnels in our jurisdiction. We had combination rail and road tunnels, and we had fire mains installed, but they weren't automatic water. We had to hook them up and to supply them. And we actually, further up in the town next to us, they did have a fire in there. It was a 4-lane divided tunnel, and they had a fire in their tunnel. And it was a pretty serious event because who's got an air pack that allows you to walk 1,000 feet into a tunnel, do firefighting, and then walk back out again? You need a rebreather.
Yeah, you need
And most fire
rebreathers.
departments do not carry those.
Saskatoon used to have rebreathers way back in the 80s when I was in that area. They had rebreathers on the one rescue truck just in case they had a parking garage or something big to
Yeah.
use. And I don't think many departments have them anymore. The mines use
Yeah.
them all the time, but
Yeah. If you got
Yeah.
that risk in your municipality, you should have.
Yeah, very few fire departments have them.
Montreal have
FDNY
rebreathers.
does.
Does Montreal have
FDN
rebreathers?
No,
No?
Well, what do you do for a
no.
metro fire?
Rely on the ventilation system. The metro has a very good ventilation system.
Yeah.
So they get all the smoke flowing in one direction and then would sneak up from the other direction.
You got that whole underground area under Place Ville Marie and all those other buildings. You can walk from building to building to
Oh
building
yeah,
underground. I remember that.
yeah.
It's a retail shopping center underground.
Yeah.
Oh, you can go a long way with hundreds of
No,
stores.
no fire
Uh,
risks there.
No risks. No.
no, just the saving grace is everything there is sprinklered.
Ah,
Yeah.
that's
So
true. You get
yeah,
the cold smoke instead of hot smoke.
yeah,
Yeah. Better tell
and
them to buy
and
some
there
rebreathers.
and there are a lot of entrances, but it's very complicated to try to find
Yeah.
your way from one area to the other, particularly if there's a little bit of smoke. It's easy to get lost in there.
Yeah, for sure. Nova Scotia Fire Department suffered multiple apparatus crashes all on the same call during the winter storms. So there was one department that lost two and another department lost one, I think, for the same kind of
Yeah, what
storm.
happened was they had a house fire which was well off the highway, and it was back on private roads. And in Nova Scotia, you can't drive anywhere on a highway without passing multiple private roads and private lanes with private bridges. Of course, big issue with bridges, like will it hold up the fire truck? And so a lot of that. So what happened here was after all these nice snowstorms and ice storms I was talking about, they were on these private roads, and these private roads are raised well above the forest floor around them because the forest floor around them tends to be boggy. So there you got quite a high embankment, and they got down on these roads, and the trucks just went off the side, and so they lost a pumper, they lost a tanker, and another mutual aid department, I think, lost a tanker. And they had other trucks that they managed to get to the site and dump their water, and they couldn't get out again because they couldn't get up the hills. They had to wait for a Department of Highways sand truck.
Oh my goodness!
So they had to pay somebody, I guess, to come and sand salt the roads so they could get out to get more water. So I don't know what happened to the house, but I can imagine what happened.
Can you imagine as a fire chief, like, okay, we're down two trucks. What are you going to do tomorrow? Right?
Yeah,
That's a tough deal if you don't have too many spares.
Yeah.
I know in
Well,
Clearwater
yeah.
it was a regional system, so we had 5 fire stations. I tried to always keep like at least a spare pumper and a tender, in reserve just in case. But it's sometimes hard to do. That reminded me of the Field BC incident years ago. I remember talking to the fire department. So Field BC is right in the center of the Rocky Mountains. It's really a train crew town where the train crews switch out and sleep, and they and there are a bunch of bed and breakfasts and a hotel, and it's a beautiful spot. But they had an incident where the fire truck and the rescue went to a highway accident, and it was icy. And the first truck responded and hit the ice and slid into the ditch near the accident or whatever. And then the other truck came over the hill, and it was their brand new, just got apparatus. And the radios don't work well in the mountains anyway. They show up and come over the crest of the hill, hit the brakes, and slide right into the other truck. And it's like, okay, we lost both trucks on the same call. Terrible thing.
Never got to the scene either.
Yeah, exactly. I think they crashed at the scene, so at least they were close. Yeah. Of course, the plane crash in Toronto, Pearson, with the plane ending up upside down. A later post video actually shows, and I think it's been shared on some of the firefighter websites, structural firefighters were really close to the building or to the plane, checking it over, making sure everybody's out, doing whatever they were doing, and fire licked up from underground. It must be fuel that leaked out from the other side under the plane and up around them, and one firefighter runs in to rescue the other firefighter who was oblivious to the fire all around him, underneath his feet. And so, that was kind of a real close call.
But the ground was completely foamed. So what this
It
was a
was.
3-dimensional fire, right? So you
Right.
had dripping
Yeah.
fuel
Yeah.
coming down.
Yeah.
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 So, but he was in doing his primary clearances, right? He was
Yeah.
an airport firefighter, and he was checking to make sure there was nobody left in the plane. So
Yeah.
part of the game,
It
right?
looks like most of the people got off the plane before the firefighters arrived. But it was almost right in front of the fire station.
The
The
the ARF
the
trucks
north.
were spraying foam as the people were getting out, or just
Yeah.
after. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure when the doors opened, that plane was about probably 300 or 400 feet, almost right in front of the fire station.
Yeah, they interviewed one of the passengers on CBC, and he said that he was a paramedic, and he was on his way to a conference, and he said that they noticed liquid running down the outside of the plane over the windows, and he said, and suddenly he could smell fuel. And they interviewed him 6 hours later, and the interviewer said, "I can still smell fuel on you,"
On you. Yeah. Yeah.
because they were walking in it because it was all over the tarmac.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. But the
That's
crush trucks, they were spraying foam right
kinda
away,
close.
which was good. Yeah, that was close.
Yeah. Yeah, close it is. Good thing it wasn't at night because, of course, the risk is you run over a passenger, right? So
Yeah.
additional hazard.
This month we're doing our From the Archives of the Last Century episode. So the regular episodes are gonna focus on after 2020, so 25 years ago, or 2000, I mean. And then we'll do another episode a month where it's something in the last century. So this year we're going to go back to March of 1993 in Pittston, PA, 32 years ago. We explore the U.S. Fire Administration report TR 073 with actually the lead investigator for that report, which is why Chief Routley, Gordon Routley, is here joining us today. So the U.S. Fire Administration develops reports on selected major fires. This was before 98, obviously, and that changed in 98 when NIOSH took it over. Unfortunately, NIOSH just had some cuts in the recent month here, so we're not sure how many more. It's going to delay some of these reports. But anyway, that's what we use for. It's great that we have a system of reports because in Canada, we have no NIOSH. We have no official reporting system to put line of duty death episodes together. So they're a lot harder to get information on. So we do appreciate these, and we appreciate these older ones as well.
They're critical, really. The information in these is critical.
Yeah,
and
for
I hope
sure.
they continue into the future.
I hope they can continue.
Yeah. Yeah. I wish we had a better system in Canada because there have been a few cases in Canada where I tried to get the information and wasn't even able to get a good report on what had happened.
Yeah, we've done several. We did the Ontario, the Listowel, the hardware store. We did Yellowknife. We did St. Thomas, Ontario recently, and Denis worked tirelessly to piece together pieces and parts and reports from various sources to make a script, because we don't have an official report of what happened. So
did some
it
drownings
is really
too.
a critical thing. These fires usually involve multiple deaths or large loss of property, the ones that the U.S. Fire Administration selected. The primary criterion for deciding to do a report whether it will result in significant lessons learned, which is why we're here. In some cases, these lessons bring to light new knowledge about fire, the effect of building construction or contents, human behavior in fire, etc. In other cases, the lessons are not new, but are serious enough to highlight once again. With another fire tragedy report. In some cases, special reports are developed to discuss events, drills, new technologies, or which are interests of the fire service. So, the overview is 2 volunteer firefighters were killed in the early morning of Monday, March 15, 1993, in the town of Pittston, Pennsylvania. The 2 firefighters, who were members of separate fire departments, were operating as a team on a hose line, attempting to locate concealed fire, when sudden and unanticipated floor collapse sent them crashing down into an inaccessible, combustible, concealed space. Even though both were wearing full protective clothing, using self-contained breathing apparatus, and with the protection of a hose line, they were unable to escape from the building or find refuge from the rapidly advancing fire conditions. Rescue teams were unable to reach the victims due to difficult access and rapid fire spread throughout the fire building and interconnected structures. The two firefighters who died were Captain John F. Lombardo of Pittston Fire Department, age 26, a 6-year fire service veteran, and Assistant Foreman Leonardo Isaclico II of West Pittston Fire Department, age 20, 2-year fire service veteran. The firefighters who died in this incident were trained and experienced and were operating in what they considered to be a normal situation with a normal approach to operational safety. The experience of this incident should carefully be considered by every firefighter and particularly by present and future incident commanders.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the fire service organization, the fire department, in other words. So Pittston is a community of approximately 9,500 people at the time of the incident, and it's located about 10 miles south of Scranton, Pennsylvania, on the east edge of the Susquehanna River. So this, just to orient people who aren't familiar with Pennsylvania, this is kind of in the northeast quadrant, and it's in the coal region, right? That was the major industry at the time.
I got to stop you there for a second. Scranton. Isn't that where that TV show The Office was? Milford Paper or something? The Office? No, you guys aren't registering at all.
No.
Oh,
The main claim to fame is it's Joe Biden's hometown.
oh, okay. Well, maybe the listeners will catch on to the show The Office in Scranton and Milford Paper. You guys probably didn't watch The Office, so I'll let you continue there, Denny. Sorry. You'll have to do that. Look it up.
Yeah. Says just, yes. So if for those of you who aren't familiar with Pennsylvania and where Scranton is, and so Pittston is in the northeast quadrant of Pennsylvania, and it's a coal region. That's the reason the town and the other towns around it were there. It's actually technically a city. And interestingly, its current population as of 2020 is now 7,600. So it's shrinking. It's I don't want to say a dying town, but it's a town under pressure, which has a big impact on the infrastructure and how the infrastructure is maintained and all of that kind of stuff. So fire protection is provided by the Pittston Fire Department, which is comprised of two separate volunteer companies, Eagle Hose Company number 1 and Niagara Engine Company number 2. Both working out of the same station, by the way. Pittston City also employs 7 career personnel. There's a fire chief, 2 assistant chiefs, and 4 drivers. So the fire chief has overall authority and is responsible for all operations, and the city owns all of the apparatus. In other words, the fire chief goes to calls, is what they're telling you here. The fire department is directly supported by the city via property tax revenues. The volunteer firefighters receive no compensation, and there's no operational distinction between the two companies at the scene of a fire. So it's not like a truck company and an engine company. They're just fire companies. And anyway, all members operate under the direction of the city fire chief and his 2 assistant chiefs. The single fire station belongs to one of the volunteer companies, but is actually staffed by the career fire personnel. Even though the community is suffering from severe economic conditions at the time of the fire, this is 30 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
And it's probably still a reflection of their reality. Anyway, the volunteer organization at the time was reported to be very stable, and the volunteer companies had invested several $1 million of revenue from their Fireman's Relief Fund, with Pennsylvania Fireman's Relief Fund, which is used then to purchase safety equipment and to provide for the health and welfare of the members and their families. This is exemplified by the recent purchase of 40 sets of new turnout gear and the use of state-of-the-art self-contained breathing apparatus and pass alarms, personal alert alarms. Again, circa 1995, I think it is.
That's pretty good, though, that they had pass alarms in 95.
Yeah, they were necessary then, although they may not have been integrated, right?
No.
Yeah, they were pretty new then.
Yeah.
But they had, I remember they had bought all new protective clothing, breathing apparatus, pass alarms, and everything the year before the fire.
Yeah. Now, things have advanced in the 30 years since then, obviously, particularly with ticks and all kinds of other stuff. But at that time, that's good. They took their money and they spent it where they needed to. So the Pittston Fire Department operated 2 Class A engines, which means frontline engines, and an elevated platform, a tower, in other words. The vehicle was equipped with spill control materials that was shared by the police and the fire departments, and was housed at the combination city hall and police station. which was approximately 2 blocks from the fire station. So this is all basically in the downtown. Emergency medical services were provided by an independent volunteer rescue squad with its own station. I don't know if that's still common in the U.S., but it was very common at that time. A few places in Canada are similar, have their own rescue squads. Did you comment on that, Gordon?
Yeah, there's still quite a few, but in a lot of communities in that part of Pennsylvania and the Northeast, the former rescue squads and ambulance services have either merged with the fire department or they've been replaced by private ambulances.
Pretty common in the Northeast, eh?
British Columbia has a lot of private rescue squads that do the accident response in the rural areas. The fire departments typically don't go to the rural areas, and they have independent rescue squads that are standalone, kind of like search and rescue. And they
under
go
contract to the province.
They get paid by the contract, by the call, by the province, and not paid very much less than fire departments get in Alberta, for example. And they respond to highway accidents, and the fire departments don't even go to highway accidents in much of rural British Columbia.
Right. So further with Pittston, the two volunteer companies together had about 100 members, of which an estimated 40 to 50 were active firefighters. So the rest of them were probably retired auxiliary type persons who were either never were firefighters or were no longer ability to be active. The minimum career staffing was 2 personnel on duty at all times, with the workload shared evenly by all 7 employees. So they rotated through. So even the fire chief, did shifts. Volunteer members were hired as part-time employees on an as-needed basis to cover for absent career personnel or to supplement staffing due to unusual conditions that might exist. In fact, this night was an unusual condition. The normal response to structure fires is to have the on-duty career personnel respond to the scene with the 2 pumpers, accompanied by any volunteers who happen to be at the station. So if you're in the station, you got on the truck. Alarms are dispatched by the Pittston Police Department, and all personnel were alerted via radio receivers, pagers in other words. The volunteer and off-duty career personnel normally responded directly to the scene to meet the apparatus. So they were responding in their private operated vehicles if they weren't actually at the station and got on the truck to start with. Pretty common way that's done. Not all people do it that way, but it is common if you've got a big area.
Very common.
So the volunteer and off-duty career personnel normally responded directly to the scene to meet the apparatus. And so that was included a callback too, right? So off-duty career and volunteers. So basically, you had a serious fire, everybody available went to the call. So there were no pre-designated crews, and it is up to the officer in command to organize the arriving personnel into operational teams. So it's so no pre-designated crews, and it's up to the officer in command to organize the arriving personnel into operational teams. The neighboring volunteer departments in West Pittston, Exeter, Jenkins Township, and Dariah provided mutual aid to Pittston on request of the incident commander. So it doesn't sound like there was automatic aid. So the career departments in the cities of Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, so Scranton to the north and Wilkes-Barre to the south, I think, yes, located north and south respectively, are also available on mutual aid. Additional assistance can be requested from other volunteer departments in Luzerne County. If you look at this on a map, you'll see there's pretty much continual city development that follows down the valley. So it's like if there weren't signs probably between the towns and cities, you wouldn't know where you were. You'd drive from one to the next.
Yeah, exactly. It's built up completely along both sides of the river, from south of Wilkes-Barre to north of Scranton,
Right.
But it's all little towns and townships and boroughs, and
Right.
most of which are typical like Pittston, like less than 10,000 population.
Right, and very hilly territory once you get away from the developed areas, right?
Yeah. Everything slopes down to the river.
Right.
It's old coal mining. There's still some coal mining going on there.
Right. Of course there is, yeah. So during the 36-hour period prior to the fire, there had been a heavy snowfall with strong winds and bitter cold that had paralyzed the community. Snow removal crews had begun to clear the streets, but most were still limited to a single lane, and many of the hydrants at that time were buried in the snow. Sort of like Toronto and Montreal right now.
Right now, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you want to say a word about that, Gordon, about how sorry you are to be in Florida?
Yeah, I feel very guilty being in Florida and talking to my friends in Montreal every day and hearing about how they've got one
He's got
lane open
tears
on
in
most
his
of the
eyes.
streets. Yeah,
I can see you crying. Yes, I see
yeah,
that.
yeah. When I read this description, it reminded me that that's just what Pittston was when I got there to do the investigation.
Nasty, yeah. So on the night of the fire chief had exercised his authority to hire 2 volunteers as part-time employees to increase the crew at the station from the 2 personnel on duty at the station to 4. It's a good thing to do.
Yep.
So the chief felt that due to the severe snow conditions that the extra personnel would be needed to assist the drivers with their routine duties of hydrant spotting, layout, and possibly digging hydrants out of the snowbanks caused by drifting and plowing. I'll bet you there are a few volunteers hanging around the station too, but I don't know if that was noted or not. So the fire station is located approximately 2 blocks from the fire scene and was adjacent to the main business district where the fire building was located. All 3 major pieces of apparatus operated by the department, so that's your 2 pumpers and the aerial, were located at the station. There was no command post vehicle provided for the chief officers to utilize, and they therefore were required to rely on their personal vehicles for response to the fire ground. So this shortage of not having a command vehicle severely limited the resources that were made available to the incident commander in his responsibilities to manage this at any incident. So the incident commander arrived in their personal family vehicle, and whatever he had the foresight to put in that vehicle or was allowed space in that vehicle was what he had tools to work with.
I remember in Richelieu, my dad had a light that he would put on the top of the old Oldsmobile or the Volkswagen Beetle that he owned and go to the fires with that. And that was the command vehicle. Yep.
I could see him driving with his hand out the window holding the light on.
Yeah. No, it was a magnet, but the
Okay.
Oldsmobile was a convertible. So he made a little metal plate that would kind of wedge into the top at the front, and he'd put the light on there with the cord into the cigarette lighter or whatever. I remember that as a kid.
Yeah,
those were the days.
If I could just describe downtown Pittston, it's a 100-year-old downtown, old buildings side by side, attached all the way down the block. When you say the fire station was 2 blocks from the fire scene, I remember parking a car at the fire station and walking to the fire scene. It was about a 90-second walk. So it's to visualize it, it's an old time Pennsylvania small town downtown. The fire occurred in a complex of buildings in the crowded central commercial district of Pittston, fronting on North Main Street. The complex was comprised of 4 original structures that had been interconnected over the years. At the front, the Main Street side, there were 2 single-story storefront occupancies. One was an optical service establishment, the other was a stationery store. At the rear, there were 2 entrances, one to a pizza parlor and to a vacant office space, opening onto Cron Street, each with a 1-story occupancy above. And due to the difference in elevation from Main Street to Cron Street, the street level facing Main Street in the front coincided with the 2nd floor at the rear of the building on Cron. The street level entrances at the rear on Cron Street were approximately level with the basement at the front of the buildings on Main Street. The 4 original...
That's a watch out situation, right? I mean, we have how many fires have we had where the upstairs, the front and the back are different levels, and that's where we kill firefighters. I mean, you could list off a dozen off the top of your head where this has happened. Of course, the Pank Street in Seattle was the big one.
Yeah. The same.
We're on the 1st floor operating, and really, you're on the 2nd floor.
Yeah.
And nobody knows where they really are.
Yeah, that's difficult.
Yeah. The 4 original structures appear to be more than 100 years old. Nobody really knew. And they've been altered many times over the years. At the front, the original the two original structures had been built as 3 or 4-story buildings, but the upper floors had been removed after a fire that's believed to have occurred in the 1950s. You could still see the outlines on the adjacent bank building. So what was left was the ground floors of those buildings. Those two buildings were essentially twins as far as structure, but didn't look the same when you looked at them from the street. But structurally, they were twin buildings with thick brick outer walls and a pair of back-to-back double-course brick walls extending from front to rear that physically separated them into two separate buildings. The narrow width appears to have been necessitated by the construction method, since the floors and roofs were supported by heavy wood joists that spanned approximately 25 feet from side to side between the brick walls. So the two together were about 50 feet wide, 25 feet on either side of the middle wall. The upper levels that had burned off at some stage included a public assembly occupancy that I was told extended through both buildings. And there was evidence of several openings at the ground floor level that had existed at one time or another as the occupancies of the buildings had changed. Openings had been made, and some of them had been bricked up, and some of them had been filled in with wood frame partitions.
These buildings were hard used.
Yeah, they'd been around for a long time, and they'd changed occupancies several times. So below the street level of those two buildings was a basement, also divided into two sections. The ground floors were supported by 3x10 wood joists that spanned between the brick walls, and they were wood floors. The clear height of the basement was reported to be too short for normal occupancy, but it was used for storage. Under the Vision Center, this space had been partially finished but was unoccupied. Then below that level, there were unfinished subcellars.
Oh boy.
The rear occupancies facing on Cron Street were originally individual structures and had been separated by the front buildings by an alley. They may also have been twin buildings because the construction details were very similar to each other and to the front buildings. But they had street level entrances from Cron Street with a cellar below and a story above. At some point, all four had been joined together. There had been an alley between the two structures that had been closed and built over to link the front and rear structures. So you end up with, what had been four separate structures facing on two streets became one big interconnected structure that was very hard to make sense out of the arrangement. It took a lot of analysis to figure it out. The rear walls of the original buildings that faced the alley had become interior walls, and there was a new section built that linked the street level at the front with the upper level at the rear. And then from the street level at the rear, you could find your way to make access to the basements of the buildings in the front. The cellars didn't connect because there was no cellar space where the alley had been located. It's believed, it was pretty evident that the interiors of the buildings had been altered numerous times over the years as the occupancies had changed. The stationery store extended back into the upper level of the structure behind it. The Vision Center occupied part of the space on that same level on the other side. There was a pizza parlor on the lower rear occupancy under the rear part of the stationery store that was operated by a relative of the stationery store owner. All of them were linked by a stairway that connected the rear of the stationery store with the pizza parlor. There was also an access stair from the stationery store leading to the basement under the main part of that store. If that sounds confusing, that's exactly what it was.
How did you figure all that out, seeing as the building was substantially burned out?
By studying the ruins and asking a lot of questions and pulling out records from the city and photographs. So it was a real puzzle to figure it out.
And an inordinate amount of time from a typical investigation, I would suggest, was spent on this portion of it.
Yeah, it was. Well, actually, in this case, the firefighting part was pretty straightforward, but figuring out the building was a lot of work. The restrooms for the pizza parlor were new construction that had been built into the part that had been the alley connection between the two buildings. So it suggests that there had been a large opening between the occupancies at one point that had been filled in by these restrooms. There was another large opening between the rear structures at the upper level that had been blocked by wood frame construction. The ground floor at the rear of the structure behind the Vision Center was vacant. It had been leased out for a variety of retail and office tenants over the years, but had been vacant for at least a year before the fire. So the only access to the area under the Vision Center was through that vacant store area on the back street, through several rooms and doorways, and up a couple of stairs. There was no stairway connecting the Vision Center on the ground floor with the area that was directly below it. So overall, just very complicated, interconnected on multiple levels, and very hard to find your way around. The arrangement of the interconnected buildings created some very unusual and dangerous conditions for firefighters. You just couldn't go from one section to another. There were dead ends and little office spaces. So, not to go through too much detail. It was just these 4 buildings that had all been joined together with multiple connections. Finally, the aged condition of the buildings would have been a major concern. They were over 100 years old. They were bricked with wood joists. There had been a previous fire that had done major damage, so it was in questionable condition, including all of the void spaces where it's doubtful if anybody ever went. While these buildings were only 2 blocks from the fire station, and most of the residents of Pittston had been in and out of the various occupancies for decades, the fire department didn't have a pre-fire plan of the buildings, and none of the fire department members we talked to reported having an intimate knowledge of the interior arrangement or the construction details of the buildings. So we really had to reconstruct all of that as part of the investigation to figure out how it had been put together.
Do you think it likely that if you were a customer and you were walking into the Vision Center on Friday and then Saturday you went and picked up a pizza on Cron Street, you'd have any concept in your mind you were in the same building?
No, I don't think so. When you think there were 3 or 4 separate occupancies, people were in and out of one, and wouldn't have thought that they were in the same building. And even somebody, if you went into the stationery store and went into the back rooms, you would never recognize that you had crossed over where the alley used to be, and now you were on the second floor of the building on the street in the back. People just, unless you thought about it with a firefighter's eye or maybe the eye of an architect or an engineer, you never would have given it a thought.
Yeah, I think my fire inspector or firefighter engine company doing a pre-plan of this building using the latest APX data tool from Ottawa there, there's no way you'd figure out
Yeah,
where you were in this building. And the pre-plan, you'd have to study it for a long time to figure it out and examine every corner and crevice. And yeah, there's no way. It'd be
yeah.
impossible.
By the time we were done figuring it out, I think we knew a lot more about it than anybody else.
Yeah. I'd say pre-planning would have been time well spent, as it turns out.
It would have
Yeah,
been, but it would have been very difficult to do.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you wouldn't
yeah.
know
But
it. I
then you
mean, your pre plan would likely be wrong.
but then you think about it and you say it's 2 blocks from the fire station in a town that's about 4 blocks long. And I say, wouldn't you think somebody would have said, "Hey, let's study this building because we might have a fire in it someday"?
But the building had been there since your great grandfather's time. And
Right.
it's one of those things, I think you go down the street, you don't even really see it.
No, no.
You know the name of
Yeah,
the guy who ran the pizza store, so and so's Pizza, but you
Yep.
don't think of 123 Main Street. You just don't.
yeah,
You should,
Okay.
but you don't.
Well, let's keep going with this thing here. So, the exposures. Exposures were not a major problem at this incident. The fire buildings were located between a 2-story bank building, estimated to be about 40 years old, and a single-story YMCA building. The exterior walls of both exposures were brick and concrete construction, abutting the exterior brick walls of the fire buildings. Both exposures had windowless walls taller than the fire building, so they weren't going to typically it wasn't going to jump over to the other building because there was no connections between them, which was good. At the interior rear of the bank was an open, large parking lot. The front and rear exposures were streets, and the single-story occupancies across Main Street and the parking lot across Crone Street. The origin of the fire was determined to have happened in the vacant area under the Vision Center from a fault in the electrical conduit. Power supply for the Vision Center was run from the rear of the building to a panel on the ground floor at the front. The wires were enclosed in conduit that was attached to the underside of the wood joist supporting the ground floor. Although the power had been shut off to the vacant part of the building, this line was still energized to supply power for the occupancy above. Due to the very cold weather over the weekend, the electrical heaters may have run continuously, causing an unusual current draw through the wires. The continuous current flow would cause wires to overheat, particularly in an area where the conduit may have been damaged, even though the current was insufficient to blow a fuse or trip a breaker. The overheating is believed to have been sufficient temperature to cause smoldering ignition of one of the floor joists, approximately 60 feet back from the front of the structure. The fire may have smoldered undetected for hours. The vacant area had an opening to an old chimney flue or vent stacked in the exterior wall, which may have allowed smoke to escape during the early stages of the fire. The downtown area was sparsely populated due to the snowfall that had started on the previous day, and if someone around had seen smoke coming from the stack, it probably would have looked like smoke from a chimney. I had this happen actually in a log home out in Nordegg, Alberta, where a truck had been block heaters been plugged into a few vehicles, and the only determinant cause we could determine ruled everything else out was the wiring overheated going to the block heaters and didn't trip the breaker but caused a fault in a spark or smoldering to start in the logs and burn the house down a few hours after the block heaters had been unplugged and the trucks left. The pizza parlor was open till 11 p.m. the night of the fire. The owner reported that he left the building around 11:30, nothing unusual. A snow removal worker noticed smoke coming from the false front of the stores on Main Street at approximately midnight on March 15, 1993. He called in by radio to Public Works dispatcher who turned in the alarm.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the response to the fire. So the alarm was transmitted by the Pittston police dispatcher at approximately midnight, and the 2 pumpers then immediately responded with the career driver and 1 volunteer firefighter in each vehicle. So that's the 4 that we talked about earlier. The other volunteers were alerted by radio and then responded directly to the scene. Responding directly to the scene in your personal vehicle on a snow-covered, heavy snow street is a challenge all by itself. just the space that you leave for firefighting purposes. Anyway, I digress. So the other volunteers were alerted by radio and then responded directly to the scene. Captain Lombardo, who lived only a few hundred feet from the scene, arrived at almost the same time as the first pumper, which only had a 2-block response. After arriving at the scene, they noted a moderate amount of lazy gray smoke coming from the eaves over the storefronts, which suggested to them that there was a minor interior fire of some type. One pumper stopped at the front of the building while the second pumper laid a supply line to it from the hydrant at Main and Water Streets. An 1.75-inch attack line was pulled as the arriving members dressed and prepared for entry. I don't know that we know how the fire was detected. Doesn't say.
Well, the smoke by the
I
public
guess
works
was
guy.
noted, yeah.
Yeah.
1.75 in 1993. That's pretty progressive too.
Well, not in my departments, but yes.
In rural Western Canada, it was.
I'm just messing with you.
I know.
The fire chief, who was at his residence in town, was unable to extricate his private vehicle from the snow to respond to the call.
Oh.
Another member of the department who was responding to the alarm then picked him up and transported him to the scene. So clearly they had portable radios they were communicating. As they arrived, they passed behind the fire buildings and noted no evidence. So they passed behind the fire buildings, that would be on Cron Street then, I guess, and noticed no evidence of fire or smoke. The first indications of a fire that was noted by the chief was the smoke coming from the false fronts over the storefronts. So there's false fronts on the front of the store. Noting that there was a possibility of a working fire, the chief then instructed the dispatcher to request mutual aid from West Pittston. The West Pittston Volunteer Company then responded to the scene from their station, which was just a few blocks away across the river. Not very far, actually, because this main street is fairly close to the river anyways, and pretty close to a bridge too, I think, Gord, right?
Yeah, it was right at the end of the bridge between Pittston and West Pittston. So I think the total response distance was about 6 blocks.
Yeah. So they would have been on scene fairly promptly, I would think, once called.
Yeah.
So the West Pittston Engine Company then laid in a supply line to the front of the buildings from the opposite end of the block while the ladder truck stopped at the rear on Cron Street. So the ladder truck went to the seaside, and the engines, I presume, were on the Alpha side.
Yeah.
Doesn't say, but I presume so.
The initial entry was made into the stationery store, since it appeared to be smoke-filled through the front windows. Forcible entry was made through the front door, and the glass was removed from the front windows. Then the line was extended into the store to search for the fire. The entry team, which included Captain Lombardo, wore full protective clothing and used self-contained breathing apparatus. They worked their way through the stationery store all the way to the rear without encountering any sign of heat or fire. They kept on extending the line down the basement stairs, which brought them into the pizza parlor, and eventually all the way to the door of the pizza parlor on Crom Street. The interior team had no portable radio to report their progress back to the fire chief, but when they got to the doorway, they made contact with firefighters who had gone around to that side of the building, and they reported that they couldn't find any sign of the fire. So the line was withdrawn back all the way back out to the front of the building where the first entry team had made their entry. And then they had to change the cylinders on their breathing apparatus. At that point, about a dozen Pittston firefighters were on the scene, as well as a similar number from West Pittston. The amount of smoke coming from the buildings had increased, but still suggested a relatively minor fire. The fire chief said that he believed that they would eventually find a burning piece of furniture or some easily controllable fire somewhere inside the building. The chief had directed one of the assistant chiefs to return to the station to bring the aerial platform to the scene of the fire. This vehicle was positioned in front of the building, we'd call side A today, where it could be used to supply power for portable lights and fans. A ground ladder was raised and a crew went to the roof to evaluate the need for vertical ventilation.
By this time, approximately 30 minutes had elapsed since the initial alarm had been transmitted. Um, the personnel in the West Pittston ladder truck had noted heavy smoke coming from the side of the building near the point where the sidewall intersected with the wall of the bank building. This is close to the area where the old chimney flue was located. So they'd been there 30 minutes and they had smoke, but they still hadn't seen any sign of fire. And they really didn't think that they had a serious fire. They thought they had something small burning somewhere in there and they just had to find it.
Yeah, I wonder if it's a case of a really big building and, smoke fills it all up and all those voids, and that wasn't emitting or wasn't visualized as a big fire, even though it might have been. The second entry team, the determination was made that the fire must be in the vision center side of the buildings. The front windows of this occupancy was removed, and forcible entry was made through the front door. Although it smelled smoke, it was smoke filled. The smoke was not alarmingly heavy, and the line was extended inside by entry teams wearing full protective clothing and SCBA. The entry crews had some trouble navigating through the smoke-filled office, but still reported finding no indications of the seat of the fire. One team used up their air supply and came outside. They were replaced by Lombardo and Insleco, who responded from West Pittston on the mutual aid request. Taking over the line, they continued to search for the fire. A second crew donned SCBA and followed the line into the building to back up Lombardo and Insleco. They reached the first team, but one of the team members of the second team was inexperienced, which caused him to become anxious working in the smoke-filled interior. His partner escorted him back out to the front of the building, where they reported to the fire chief that Lombardo and Insleco appeared to have located the fire in an interior room. This was estimated to be nearly an hour into the incident. Wow, my fire chief alarm bells are ringing like crazy. Another two-member entry team was assembled, and the members followed the line back to where Lombardo and Insleco were last seen. As they worked their way back, they encountered much greater heat and came upon an area where flames were coming up through a large hole in the floor. The hose line appeared to extend into the crater, and there was no sign of Lombardo or Insleco. They quickly returned to the exterior to report their findings.
Right.
No mention here of change outside fire conditions. Chief Routley never said all of a sudden a puff of smoke came out or anything like that.
No, in fact, they said the smoke had been gradually increasing, but even at that stage, it wasn't alarming.
Interesting.
It was still that, okay, we're going to find something small burning inside here.
Yep.
After an hour.
But the West Pittston ladder crew had spotted smoke coming from between the bank building and the Bravo side of the Vision Center. And they were located on the Charlie side, so on Cron Street. So what they saw was coming actually from the back corner of the bank building, which is halfway up the Vision Center building, right? So they saw smoke issuing under pressure there. So that kind of is an alarm bell, right? And I don't know if that got to the IC.
It would be if they had told anybody.
Yeah. Did it get to the IC? That was
that
was what I was saying.
Yeah.
That's important information in my mind. And as it turns out, I think that's almost exactly where the two guys were lost, right in that corner.
Relatively close. Yeah. And again, reconstructing who was talking to whom. There was no radio traffic because there were only a couple of people on the scene with portable radios. The interior crews didn't have portable radios. So most of the communication was face to face. So if there was any report that the crew on the roof had seen some smoke, it was probably filtered through 2 or 3 people before it got to the fire chief, who was at the front of the building on side A.
So by the same token, of course, there would have been no mayday from Lombardo or Insleco at all. So they were just last seen in this area, and that's the information they had.
Yeah. The crew that went in that discovered the hole, it was thinking that they were just going in to give them a hand, and they were caught completely by surprise when they got back there and said, there's fire back here and a hole in the floor.
Yep.
So,
And the hose
but at
line
that
going
point,
down.
of course, right, the temperature on that first floor Alpha side, second floor Charlie side, the temperature, and they'd taken all the front windows out of the store, at least on the stationary store. I don't know what they did on the Vision
Yep.
store. They
They
didn't
did. Yeah, they
talk
just
about
did.
those windows. So now
Yep.
you've got fire up the floor, straight out the front windows, right? So
Yep.
you've got a real flow path going there now. So it must have become very difficult from that point onwards.
Yeah, it went pretty fast after that.
Not surprised. Plus, you got 150-year-old tinder. So we're going to talk a little bit about the rescue attempt. So by the time the second crew, which found the hole in the floor, by the time they reached the street, it was obvious that fire conditions were changing rapidly, for the worse, I'm suggesting. The smoke coming from the front of the building was hotter and heavier, and the crew on the roof reported that the heat and smoke issuing from their vent hole, we didn't know that they'd actually cut a hole in the roof, but they had, I guess, that they were getting a lot more smoke and heat coming out of that roof vent. A second attack line was advancing into the building from the Alpha side, I guess, but the crew could not reach the area where the floor had collapsed, which was on the Bravo side of the Bravo building, right? So back on that left-hand side there. But the crew could not reach the area where the floor had collapsed. The fire was rapidly involving the ground floor area and had no access to the basement that they could find. One of the assistant chiefs took another crew around to the Cron side of the building and forced entry through the door into the vacant office space. So this would be their first floor, but from the Alpha side would be the first basement. A hose line was taken from the second Pittston engine through this door and extended back through the offices towards the front section of the building. Initially, they only saw light smoke that was encountered, but as they reached deeper into the building, they encountered heat and heavy smoke that stopped further penetration. So they're getting to the seat of the fire, I guess, is what's happening there. They were unable to reach the area under the front section of the building before they were forced to retreat from the building. So they got stopped at about the alleyway, would you say? They got about as far as the old alleyway?
Yeah, roughly at the alleyway, but nobody was really sure how far they had gone because it was so cut up.
Yeah, right on. So after that, they went into a defensive fire operations, right? Pulled everybody out. So fire was spreading rapidly through the Vision Center, which is on the left side from the Alpha side, and on the upper level through the spaces below, and soon flames were visible in the stationary store, which was to the right on the Alpha side. So somehow it breached between those two walls, right, where looked like there had been old openings that had been closed up. But I think you said earlier that there were still other openings, right, where plumbing and whatever went back and forth, right?
Yeah, there had even been doorways in between that had been closed up. So there was
How well, right?
nothing. Yeah, nothing was solid.
Right. So not a firewall by any stretch, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
So the situation became a defensive operation as the fire extended throughout the interconnected building. So now it's got 4 buildings potentially on fire. The aerial platform was set up in the front. That would be the Pittston aerial platform. And the West Pittston aerial ladder was set up in the rear parking lot. So there was an aerial on the Alpha side and an aerial on the Charlie side. And they were applying elevated master streams in order to protect the exposures. So that'd be exposures on the Bravo side and the Delta side. Additional mutual aid companies called for and responded, but they were unable to prevent the total involvement and destruction of all of these 4 interconnected structures. The fire was, of course, confined to the complex of 4 structures and was then brought under control by mid-morning. So what, like 9-10 hours later, 11 hours later, that type of thing?
Yeah, it burned all night.
And the guys had been lost for, sometime a little after an hour into the fire?
Yeah,
5-6
somewhere
hours.
between an hour and an hour and a half when things changed.
So they were inside this burning inferno for 9+ hours, 8 or 9 hours. Not really a rescue attempt.
So unfortunately, the next segment, body recovery. It was known almost immediately that when the floor collapse was discovered, that the firefighters were missing, but the specific number and identities of the missing members was in doubt because of that no crews, right? Everybody was assembled on scene. There was no formal system for accounting members on the scene, and interior crews had rotated at least twice while searching for the fire. The two missing members had responded with two different companies, and Inslaco was wearing turnout coat labeled with the name of a third department and the rank of assistant chief, which added to the confusion, so he didn't have his coat on. It was only by a process of elimination that the personnel at the scene were able to conclude that Lombardo and Inslaco were missing and presumed to have fallen into the basement. By the
And these
time
are from two different departments, eh, Paul?
Yep, two different departments, and everybody shows up on scene and gets assigned, and similar to Charleston, even though they were all from the same department, but you had all the different guys showing up on their own, right?
Yeah.
Especially
Yeah.
things went on. Who's in there?
But at that time, like I was chief in a department that had a working accountability system at this time. And we used cow tags. I mean, they weren't.
Yeah, we had little Lamicoid labels. You had a yellow and a red one, and the yellow meant you were on scene, and the red meant you were on air.
Right. I was in the rural area. We used cow tags. They were pretty available.
Yep. There's a lot of departments around here that had cow tags too, hanging on the back of your helmet with a little clip.
Yeah. A dog snap.
Dog snap. Yep. By the time the fire was brought under control, the roofs, floors, and some of the walls had collapsed, and additional sections of ice-encrusted brick walls were in danger of collapse. For most of the morning, crews worked to try to find a way to penetrate the massive rubble to search for the bodies of the missing firefighters. They eventually discovered an abandoned coal bin in the front of the Vision Center, so Alpha side, with a small access cover built into the sidewalk. Oh, wow.
Would have been under snow, of course.
Yep, right. The Scranton Fire Department Rescue Squad responded to the scene, and after a backhoe had been used to provide larger access into the coal bin, the members were able to drop down into the front part of the basement storage area. From there, they had to turn back, had to tunnel back through the rubble more than 60 feet, handing debris out and passing shoring materials in before they finally discovered the two bodies.
Wow.
As assumed, the two firefighters had fallen through the floor into the void space and were trapped in the rubble of the floor joists and furniture that had fallen through the hole with them. The bodies were carefully removed through the path that had been tunneled in from the coal bin on the Alpha side, and further exploration of the area confirmed that no additional members had been lost.
Thank God they had mining skills, because they probably used them, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a real tunneling job to get in there. I mean, it was just
to be honest with you, if that had been my fire today, there's no way I would have done that. I would have got a backhoe in to pull all that debris out to tunnel in by hand and shore it by hand. It's not something you would consider doing today.
Not really.
Well, yeah, really.
You might, but probably not.
They were operating like a rescue squad, but it was a body recovery. But it was just a massive rubble.
Very brave thing to do.
Not unlike Baltimore 3 years ago.
Yeah.
They have very similar type of operation, trying to find the guys and dig holes. They dug holes in from the other building next door to go into.
That was rescue.
They were rescuing at the time. Yeah. They were rescuing. They didn't know they were dead.
These guys are in recovery.
Yeah, that's right. So would you risk a building coming down on them for a recovery?
Yeah. So I already said they'd been in there for 9 hours. It was not a rescue.
Right.
I don't think.
Yeah. Okay, give us your analysis, Chief.
Well, let's talk about analysis. It appears from the positions of the bodies and the furniture that had fallen on top of them that most of a room had dropped into the basement without warning. The other firefighters who had seen the fire reported that Lombardo and Inslaco appeared to be fighting a fire that was coming up around the baseboards of a room, well back inside the Vision Center when they were last seen. So, that sort of makes sense visually, that the fire's coming up, through the floor into the baseboards. and that's where they were operating. And then
So
the two
this building was an ordinary constructed building, right? Masonry
Yeah.
walls, timber
Yeah.
floors, and so forth. So
Yeah.
we know that there's lots of void spaces, right?
But the Pang fire was the same thing. They had fire coming up around the edges of the walls.
Yeah.
Right.
The only difference with Pang was there was a concrete topping on the floor,
Right.
which
Right.
concealed it even more.
Yeah.
Right.
But this was probably 3 or 4 inch thick wood floors.
Yeah.
So the fire finally got up into the baseboards. Further investigation of the fire found that the probable point of ignition was in the same area where the collapse occurred, probably almost directly underneath the room where the collapse occurred, underneath the floor where the two firefighters were working. The fire probably ignited one of the 3x10 wood floor joists, and it may have smoldered for hours before it was discovered. Large wood beams of this type have been known to burn for more than 24 hours before open flaming was observed. An electrical short could have ignited more than one joist, or the fire might have spread at a slow rate in the very old wood joists and floor decking. Those joists may also have been weakened by age and rotting, so they could have been much weaker than one would have expected from their basic appearance.
But the age of the building, at the age of the building, though, these joists 3x10s, we're talking real 3 by real 10, right?
Oh yeah,
So these are heavy timber.
Yeah.
Denise pet peeve of modern lumber.
Yeah. No, this was serious modern lumber when trees were trees.
Yeah. So but I mean, there's a lot of meat there. So it explains how the thing could burn for however long it took to get a fire noticed, let alone how long they were on scene messing with it for an hour and a half, and then it collapsed. Right? Like that would never happen in modern construction.
Yeah, it wouldn't. In modern construction, it would have been in the basement in 10 or 20 minutes.
Hopefully before you got there.
My first house, all the floor truss joists and roof trusses were fir. And that stuff was terrible stuff to cut and to nail into. You had to pre-drill nail holes pretty well to use it. I built the deck out of them, and just the deck is still standing there today, 40 years later. And that same kind of stuff here in this building, I'm sure. Yeah. That house was built in the 50s.
Yeah. But the danger of this, of course, is that it seems strong until suddenly it isn't, right?
Yeah.
And, it can be a considerable amount of time, and you could be fooled by it if you're not really thinking about what you're working with.
Yeah. If you don't know what's underneath you and you don't realize that the fire is underneath you. And I'm thinking then when you get there and you find fire coming up around the baseboards, you're standing on a big solid wood floor. You're not thinking that this is about to drop out from under you.
You're in the frying pan.
Yeah. Yeah. So when the fire finally grew to a stage that significant amounts of smoke were being produced, but it was still contained by the solid wood decking of the floor, as well as the joists. So the crews spent an estimated 60 minutes searching for the fire without finding it or even detecting any level of heat on the upper level that would have been alarming. By the time the fire became visible on the ground floor, collapse was imminent from below. The circumstances suggest that the collapse occurred totally without warning. Some of the personnel outside reported that they heard a loud cracking noise or a pop just before the heat and smoke conditions began to change rapidly. Within minutes, the appearance of the situation changed from non-threatening to an obvious major fire.
Did they have thermal cameras?
No. Thermal cameras were still pretty rare.
Expensive is what they were.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah.
There was no access from the ground level of the vision center into the space below where the firefighters had fallen. Although this space had been used previously by a previous occupant for storage, the only way to check this area would have been to enter from the rear street the way the rescue attempt was subsequently made, all the way to the rear street, through the vacant office area, work your way back through the maze, and eventually you'd find your way into the area underneath the vision center. Both firefighters were found to have been using their self-contained breathing apparatus at the time of the collapse and were properly attired in full protective clothing. While these items provided as much physical protection as is generally feasible for interior structural operations, it appears that they quickly succumbed to the combination of their fall and then entrapment in the fire area. Examination of the personal protective clothing and equipment revealed no deficiencies. At least one of the firefighters had a pass device attached to his SCBA. It was impossible to determine from the damaged parts if it had been turned on or operated during the entrapment. None of the rescuers reported to have heard a pass device operating.
If the floor collapse, just speculation, if the floor collapse had been witnessed by another crew and another crew had seen the floor collapse and these two guys go down in, what was the prospects of them being able to do anything to rescue them right there and then? It seems a real stretch that they would have been able to do that.
Great, that's a situation that's occurred at several other incidents, and there have been some successful rescues in situations like that where it was recognized right away, where there were other hand lines close by. I'm trying to think of one case where they actually passed another hand line to the firefighters who were inside to use to protect themselves, lowered a ladder down in. But in this case, nobody was really sure even how long they had, how much time had elapsed between when they fell in and when it was discovered. It could have been 2 or 3 minutes. It could have been 10. And by the time that the hole was discovered, fire was coming up through it, and it was probably too late for that kind of a rescue attempt.
Yeah, and you're into 2.5 inch territory, really, and they stretched an 1 3/4 in, right? So I mean, if they'd have known the fire was in the basement, they had, I think, other alternatives like dropping in a distributor or some other method of dealing with it, but they just didn't know. They weren't prepared for that to happen.
Yeah, and talking to the firefighters who were there, nobody was thinking fire below, basement fire. They were thinking like, well, we're going to find a fire back here somewhere, but they weren't thinking it's in the basement under our feet.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So some lessons learned here, of course, which is why we're here. Several points need to be considered with respect to the way this fire presented itself and the actions that were taken by the firefighters based on this information. And these old buildings still exist all across the nation, all across the continent. So
definitely
something we need to be aware of. So command officers must consider the possibility that a fire which cannot be located is attacking the floor below the search teams. One of the important lessons to be learned about from this fire is the danger of a fire burning undetected below an area where firefighters are working. Several situations in the past have had similar consequences, and we mentioned some of them here on the podcast today. Officers must track the passage of time and assume that a fire that cannot be located may be a growing threat. The estimated time from arrival to collapse at this incident is an hour. For this entire period, firefighters looked for a concealed fire that gave evidence that it was relatively minor because of that minor amount of smoke and heat. They continued to operate in a minor fire mode, despite the prolonged time, without locating the source of smoke. Officers must maintain an accurate awareness of the passage of time, and if the fire cannot be located, the assumption must be made that it's likely to become more serious. And you were just talking about that, Denis, is what was their mindset at the time of the fire, and they kept getting fooled by the amount of smoke and heat in this massive structure that was all chopped up.
But when they arrived on scene on the Alpha side, if I can divide the fire into a alpha to the right and alpha to the left, alpha to the right was the stationery store. That was full of smoke or something at that time, I think it was. And they took out the doors and the windows because the store was full of smoke. That's not a minor fire. That's a fire that has filled a building full of smoke. So there's something going on in there.
But it's a deceptively large building.
They misread it.
You misread it. Yep.
Yeah.
So beware.
And they said that there was no sensation of heat. There was smoke, but you could still see. It wasn't a case where you had to feel your way around. You could still see, but there was smoke everywhere.
Big
But
building.
But also, Gordon, you know yourself, fires in the winter and fires in the summer, they don't behave the same way.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
And cold buildings in the wintertime, you may not feel, particularly a masonry building that's been sitting 3 months in sub-zero temperatures in the wintertime in northeast Pennsylvania, where it's just as cold there as it is here. That building is a huge heat sink, and it can take quite a while before you'll start feeling the heat of that building. And so the smoke even inside is just not superheated. It's just sitting there. And that wasn't, I don't think, considered either.
Yeah. And the time is really a key factor. I mean, that's why a lot of fire departments have, time announcements.
Time checks.
That say,
and PARs.
15 minutes or 20 minutes. That's just to remind the incident commander, say, this is where you are. And you got to say, okay, at 20 minutes, if we haven't found the fire yet, I got to say, let's think again.
Yeah.
40 minutes and we haven't found the fire yet? Boy, we better think again. 60 minutes and we haven't found the fire yet. Boy, this is, you got to think. But even then, you got to think hard enough to figure out what you're dealing with.
Yeah. And those who don't have a lot of command experience don't realize that keeping track of time in your head when there's a lot of stuff going on, it's damn difficult. And time just time contracts. Things seem to go slowly, but yet time is going quickly. It's the weirdest thing. And you just don't really have a good feel for how much time has elapsed. So hence what you were talking about, time stamping is really important.
And if this has never happened to you before and you haven't read reports or heard the stories about how it happens, this might not even be in your playbook.
Yep. Okay, recommendation 3, infrared heat scanning devices, in other words, TICs, thermal imaging cameras, can provide valuable assistance in locating hidden fires. A handheld infrared heat scanning device could have proven invaluable at this incident by helping the interior crews to quickly locate the hidden fire below the floor. These devices have been available for years, even at the time of this writings, and are relatively and reliable and inexpensive. I don't know if I'd argue the inexpensive part there.
They were about 20 grand or something back then.
They were 20 grand, and they were not tiny. They were
big
honking things.
Yeah.
And we had one in our department, and we had one, and it was a Raytheon, and one of the earlier brands. And when the transmitter went in it, we had to package it up and ship it to Britain. It took 6 months to come back to get it repaired.
Yeah.
So not everybody had them, just saying.
Well, as I recall, the lower cost, more user-friendly cameras had just come out at this time.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. Yeah.
Yeah. We fundraised for like an MSA for 14 grand or something back in the 90s.
And trying to get council to approve money for a TIC was like pulling teeth.
Yeah.
It really was. So number 4 recommendation, old buildings can be death traps. That's a common theme, I think, on our podcast here.
Yep.
Buildings that are old and have been renovated numerous times, and I would comment here that probably renovated more times than you were even aware of, and are exceptionally dangerous to firefighters. They may have inaccessible void spaces, unknown paths whereby fire can build and spread. fire's a gas essentially. It can seep through a crack you couldn't see through, and openings where smoke can migrate. This can all confuse firefighters who are looking for the fire's actual location. But regardless of general appearances, they may have a major structural weakness that has developed over the years, and then it just takes a fire to take the building down. Or a heavy refrigerator.
Yeah. Pre-fire plans are essential for complex structures. The complex of structures that was involved in this fire was extremely complicated and contained several features that should have been recognized as both problems and dangers to the firefighters. But these factors could only have been recognized through pre-fire plan visits and should have been recorded in a standard pre-fire plan format to support the officer in command of a fire at this location. It's interesting to note that most of the firefighters were somewhat familiar with the buildings. They've been in and out of those occupancies for years and years, but they had no awareness of the details of the construction or arrangement. And how many times have we heard that before? It's 2 blocks from the fire station. We've been in and out of it all the time. Did we ever stand back and say, we really need to do a pre-fire plan and figure out all of the interconnections and nooks and crannies and how it's built and how it's supported? So that's really important.
Yeah, Paul knows what I'm going to say at this point, and it's that, if you're a firefighter, anytime you walk through your fire district, you should be saying, okay, I know how that's built. I know how that looks like inside. Or I'm thinking about that building. What if there was a fire there? You need to be doing that stuff, not just going into the 5 and dime for a candy and leaving it. And that's your only thought for
like
the day.
Our friend, the producer of the building construction for the fire service on Facebook, Rick DeGroot, says, know your local. You got to know your local. You got to know the buildings.
And Francis Brannigan used to say, the building is your enemy.
That's right.
Yeah. I think back in Montreal, this is going back, probably close to 10 years.
Recent history.
Recent history.
Compared to this.
A captain who was a good friend of mine called me and said, we just discovered this building in our first due area. We were doing some checking around, and we're really worried about it. Have you got time to come by and have a look at it? And it was
good initiative.
And it was about 10 minutes from my office and 5 minutes from his fire station. So I met him over there, and we looked at it. It was a 3-story building that was still occupied but not in use, but full of furniture and just loaded to the gills with fuel. And I looked at it with him for about 15 minutes, and I said, if this place is ever on fire, don't even think about going inside. And about 6 months later, it was on fire. And thank goodness they didn't even think about going inside. It went to 5 alarms, and down it came.
Wow.
Wasn't a problem after that, though.
Yeah.
And exactly. I got rid of that one. And the building next door. Incident management procedures should be practiced and utilized at all fires. The direction of operations at this incident was conducted without the benefit of a standard incident management system or structure. The fire chief did not have the support of established systems to process information, analyze problems, supervise interior operations, communicate with the interior crews, or support a complicated interior operation. The lack of a safety officer and the inability to communicate with interior crews were serious problems at this incident.
Yeah, definitely no surprise there.
Had Bruno not been up to the Northeast doing his tour of
Fire Command?
Fireground Command dates to the 80s. I used to teach it in the 80s.
We had actually been there together within 10 miles of this place.
But
And everything on this list is directly out of his manual.
but so many little departments working on their own. They're all independent cities, independent departments, and that's where it gets lost.
This is a full-time fire chief.
Yeah.
Full-time paid fire chief.
Yep.
Yeah. Don't get me started.
Okay. We'll save that one for another day.
This was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Filter out that comment, but don't get me started because I could go off on a tangent.
Okay. Don't do that.
We don't do that on this show.
No. Yeah.
Rabbit hole.
Okay. So number 7, personal accountability systems should always be used, particularly at structure fires. The establishment of effective accountability systems for all personnel is operating at the scene of fires, particularly for those working in interior operations, has become standard safety practice, even in 1993, and more so today. This type of system can greatly reduce the risk of overlooking personnel when a building must be evacuated. It also reduces the probability that personnel may become trapped or incapacitated and that no one will be aware that they were missing or even who they are. I put a personal note in here, or no, this is your note. The similarities of this fire should be compared to the incident in Breckenridge, Pennsylvania that happened in 1991, 2 years before this fire, and the 14th Street collapse in New York City in 1966, 20 years before this fire. 2 fires that had similar circumstances and lessons learned that claimed the life of 16 firefighters. And I think, of course, of Seattle, a Pang fire, very similar as well, 1995, 2 years later.
Yeah.
So, any closing comments, you guys?
These buildings are still in the communities, particularly in the Northeast. There's here when I was in Ontario, I could drive down any small town and I could see buildings just like this. They're all over the place. There's literally thousands of them.
We got them. I got them here in Lacombe, downtown. Lacombe is renowned for its ancient architectural downtown main street, and it's an incident waiting to happen.
Yeah. And what we got to count on is that the fire is well enough advanced by the time we get there that nobody thinks about doing an interior attack.
Yeah, exactly.
So no Tarzan stuff.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to another Emergency Traffic podcast. We hope that you find these informative. Please give us a like and tell a friend, and let's be safe out there. Thanks to my guests for joining us on this look back in the archives.